Welcome back, Chappelle. Welcome back to your flipped classroom and our continuing discussion of the downfall of Napoleon. Now, the big thing about it, though, is we left off in class, pretty much in all of our classes, talking about the downfall of Napoleon and his exile following the failed Russian invasion, which I love the fact that y'all are just getting this stuff right now, right? And I think a lot of it has to do with the fact that I used to use this really old garbage Google Slides for actually talking about this stuff, but I actually transferred it into a Prezi. Makes a lot more sense, flows a lot better, looks a lot more aesthetically pleasing. So I went ahead and did it for the next section as well. This is that random time of year where apparently I just use these garbage presentations. But I thought I had kids in the back of my mind like Brianna Trinacosta and like Emma Godoy and like several other people as well, like Reagan Lacoste and Lauren Valino, who always really, really like it when the Prezis are aesthetically pleasing, and they like it because it helps them remember stuff a little bit better. So I went ahead and did all that stuff and transferred it all in. I made these things pretty and flow well, and I think it's really helping. So I like that. But if you have any questions going into it, I am going to go ahead and post your study guide so you can start using it, so you can start actually studying and preparing. Now remember, if you have any questions about when the test dates and stuff like that are going to be, just ask. But let's go ahead and dive right back in to where we left off. So in class, we were talking about that failed Russian invasion, right? That Russian invasion by Napoleon, which remember, Madeline Trosclair, Avery Scheck-Snyder, when y'all decide to become dictators of Europe, don't invade Russia. It's always a bad plan, right? Now, look, we're going into it, though, is that's where we left off. The horrible invasion of Russia that fails miserably due to the Russians using that scorched earth technique, and they're actually going to end up running like Napoleon now completely, burning their own city of Moscow to the ground, just so he never fell into his hands, right? Well, he's going to return to France, miserably humiliated, right? Losing 590,000 of his 600,000 grand army, and he's going to return, and then 2 years later, the coalitions will reform, they go after him, they arrest him, and they exile him to the island of Elba. Now, as we already know as well, he only spent about 9 months on Elba, because he felt that the treaty was broken, and he gets a bunch of boats together, and he just leaves, right? Like, now, and it was also kind of really, really dumb to, like, put him on Elba when it's like, oh, I don't know, this close to Italy, and he can just get back that fast, right? But anyway, that's not that important, okay? Because the big thing about it is actually the story of him escaping and stuff like that, and the story of Napoleon is so famous that they actually even used his whole escape from Elba in a Red Bull commercial back in the day. Like, check this out.
He was just a boy from Corsica, a math student with a decent scorsica. Then he helped all the big guys storm the Bastille, which made some people think he was the real deal. From Austria and Egypt to Italy, if you wanted something done, he was the man to see. I am the French emperor, he liked to say. The ones who disagreed, well, they didn't get to stay. Outnumbered by his enemies, he found himself banished to a place called Elba, where he basically vanished. He managed to escape because he knew a few things, like, for instance, Red Bull gives you wings.
I know. Don't tell me that history's not all over the place. Red Bull used to run that literally on like college football game day and all this other kind of stuff. But anyway, so the big thing about it is after he leaves from Elba, because Red Bull gives you wings, he went back to Europe and he took back over France for 100 days, right? He took it back over for about 100 days. And this is the term given to the time period where Napoleon would regain power back in France for about 100 days. He reforms his army. Problem with the army that he reforms is that it was wildly underprepared, right? It was a lot of young guys that kind of looked up to him as this like figure of French nationalism and French pride and things like that, and they just weren't very well trained. And also Napoleon did something really stupid. He just made a couple of mistakes, right? Several uncharacteristic mistakes at a very, very famous battle known as the Battle of Waterloo, right? And you've probably heard the Battle of Waterloo before because it's actually in this famous ABBA song. Because it's where Napoleon did surrender. Now the thing about it, though, going into it as well, the coalitions will reform, beat Napoleon, his young trained army, and that historic Battle of Waterloo, he would lose a second time. He actually lost to this guy named the Duke of Wellington and stuff like that, which I don't know if it's where beef Wellington comes from or not. I'll have to look it up, but I do know that my wife makes a very mean beef Wellington. It's super, super good. My dad actually says it's the best thing he's ever eaten. Now, the thing about it, though, as well, going into it, he was then exiled to St. Helena, which is going to be an island very far away, right? After the failing of the 100 Days campaign and after being taken over at the Battle of Waterloo, he is exiled to the island of St. Helena, which is thousands of miles away from Europe. It's off the coast of South Africa. He apparently died in boredom and stuff like that, and in 1821, after 6 years of living there, he died due to stomach cancer, right? Now, the thing about it is they're going to bring his body back to France. He's actually currently entombed at that place called the Hotel des Invalides, where the kind of French Revolution really, really got started off when they raided it for all those different goods and items, okay? Now, that right there is his death mask, right? They actually took a plaster casting of his face whenever he died so they could actually understand what it looked like going into it. But the thing about it is, guess where this is located? none other than the Cabildo in the French Quarter in New Orleans, right? Like, so interesting little thing, though, is that there's 3 of them total. We have one, there's one in Italy, and there's one in England, I believe. And the 3 groups always argue over whose is the real one. More than likely, ours isn't. I'm just throwing it out there. Most likely, ours is one of the fake ones. But still, it's kind of cool that we have one of Napoleon's death masks. Apparently, it was about to be thrown away on the back of a garbage truck, which is absolutely wild. Now, look, this is where things are going to get shifty, though, okay? You're going to need a brand new section of your notes, a new section of color for your notes, something that's going to delineate the stuff that we're about to talk about from the stuff we just talked about, okay? Because I hate to break this to you, but we're doing it yet again. We're talking about something that was going on at the same time during all this other shenanigans, okay? So you are just like, oh no, why? Now look, the big thing about it is, think about it this way. This is just how history works, and it's especially how European history works. Next year, your life will be a lot easier when you're talking about U.S. history because you'll just be kind of stair-step walking your way through the content. It's going to be like, this happened, and then this happened, and then this happened, and this happened. So this is getting you prepared for, like, this is like going through the gauntlet to do a coloring book, you know, like the next, like, few years. Not that it's not very difficult because I know that U.S. content can be intense, but you know what I'm saying. It's just easier to remember that stuff, right? But look, big thing about it is, what have we been talking about for the last 2 units? We've been talking about the Enlightenment, and we've been talking about the French Revolution and the Napoleonic era, right? 3 things that all go together because the Enlightenment caused the French Revolution, and then the French Revolution, the end of it, was when Napoleon came to power, right? That ranged from about like 1750 to about 1815, give or take, right? What we're now about to start talking about is the Industrial Revolution, right? Now, let's talk about it in general. I think you should definitely change colors, go into a new section, maybe even start a brand new fresh page, because this was happening at the exact same time as the Enlightenment was going on in continental Europe, as the French Revolution, and as the Napoleonic period, right? Now, the big thing about it is the Napoleonic period ends in 1815, okay? Like, so when he gets exiled to St. Helena for the second time, and it the entire thing starts off, big other dates, 1789 is when the Bastille was stormed, okay? And then also going back to it, the 1750s is when the Enlightenment begins with all your French philosophers and philosophes, right? Well, what we're talking about now is that Industrial Revolution, which we got to talk about, like, well, what is the Industrial Revolution, Mr. Terry? Well, what it is something that I actually really enjoy talking about because it's so easy. It just makes complete sense, right? Because all it is this time period from about 1760 to about 1840-ish, like, so give or take, when the production of goods went from being simple and handmade and wildly inefficient, right, to a larger factory-based model, which is much more like the one we use today, right? We went from making clothes by hand in the 1760s to instead making them in factories that would produce them more automatically, right? And it's mostly due to a series of different inventions that would actually mechanize and make things much more efficient, right? Mechanization and efficiency are very big themes of the Industrial Revolution because it's all about how are you producing items and how are you doing it better, right? How are you doing it better? How are we getting rid of human error? How are we also trying to make it so they are made faster and cheaper and more accessible to more classes, right? Now, of course, there's going to be massive downsides to the Industrial Revolution as well. This is not a great time because, as you can see, one of the biggest downsides to the Industrial Revolution is going to be the creation of pollution and stuff like that. And another massive downside is going to be, of course, the life of the worker right here is going to be absolutely awful, even when things are mechanized and stuff like that. Now, also, I don't know if I'm sure you have talked about this a little bit before in middle school and things like that. The Industrial Revolution, people would work really long hours, the machines were really unsafe and stuff like that. Child labor was a really huge issue during that time period as well. So also, though, what your major changes are going to be seen during the Industrial Revolution are going to be in places like textile production. Now, really quickly, if you don't know what the word textiles means, let's go ahead and chat about that real quick. Also, speaking of child labor, you can actually see textile production in this photograph that has child labor in it, right? What is this little boy actually preparing to reload? It is a spool of thread, right? Because he works in a textile factory. Textile is cloth, okay? Like, this is a textile, okay? So, like, it's the creation of cloth and other cheap cloth items, right? Now, other things about it as well, you're going to see the creation of major changes in factory systems. Mining of iron and coal is going to be really big for any of our Minecraft fans out there. We're going to talk about smelting at one point in class. It's going to be a good time. Now, the big thing about it, though, also the refinement of metals and transportation. You also see a population explosion, which is another thing we'll talk about a little bit later on. Now, going into it, though, the one thing out of all those changes that I don't really spend any time talking about because I feel like it's pretty obvious is the transportation one, right? We're going from horses and buggies and horses and carts to moving in the direction of locomotives, trains, chugga-chugga-ah, with, you know, like DC and Genevieve all aboard the choo-choo train. I can't put a clip of that video in here because Mickey Mouse will ban my video. I tried to do it last year, and they were like, "Where's the flip, Mr. Terry?" And Mickey was like, "Oh, too bad you can't do it today." Like so, and literally just blocked my like video from the entire internet, right? But transportation-wise, we're just getting more efficient. We're moving to locomotives, steam-powered boats, and stuff like that. And so the Industrial Revolution is going to wildly change how people move around. Okay, so like the thing about it though is like to give you a graphic to look at real quick. Just let's look at this real fast, okay? This is how cloth was made before the Industrial Revolution. By hand on a device called a loom or a lap loom, right? This is how people moved around before the Industrial Revolution. In a wagon with a horse and a buggy, right? So like then also, these were our social classes before the Industrial Revolution. You had your king, your nobles and your charge officials, your knights and vassals, your serfs and your peasants, and your feudal system, right? Well, then what's going to become very, very big in the Industrial Revolution is things more like this. Factory systems, locomotives, and new social classes that are going to pop up. We're going to see the middle class be born and rise. Well, the middle class is there already, but it's going to grow tremendously quickly, and it's going to become the largest class out of all of them. And then the working class at the very, very bottom, which is really, really messed up. But the other big question about it is, if this is happening at the entire time while the French Revolution is going on, the question is, where is it happening? Because how is it possible? Because Napoleon took over like the entire continent of Europe. So how is an industrial revolution happening under Napoleon's nose that he doesn't know about, right? It's all about where it's going down. And it's going down in Great Britain. But the better question is, why is it going down in Great Britain, right? So like, why is the Industrial Revolution starting and beginning in Great Britain and will eventually spread to the rest of the continent? But why is it going down there versus everywhere else, right? Well, a lot of it has to do with the things that Great Britain has that the continent does not, right? Well, one big one is that it's an island, right? It's an island and it has colonies everywhere, right? The fact that it's an island kept it separate from the rest of the continent while these different things are going on, but also on Great Britain, if you're standing on Great Britain, you are never more than 50 miles away from a waterway that it can actually get you access to a trade port or city, right? There are canals, and canal construction was going to be very easy in the fact that, like, on this island. And then also, the other big thing about it is that Britain had colonies all over the place, right? Had colonies in India. It had colonies growing in places like Jamaica. It had colonies growing like in different areas all over the planet. The Falkland Islands and things like that off the coast of South America. Britain had access to not only its own waterways, but could then use them to trade goods back to their own colonies after they used the raw materials that had actually come from them, right? Now, also, another big thing about that is if you have a trade and like big, very, very, very large amount of boats and have a big trade company, what's the name of that big trade company that we talked about in the past, that this is going to be the exact same one? It's going to be called the East India Company, right? That EIC, still very large, still very powerful, and moving goods all over the planet by this point. Now, also, though, they had a massive naval fleet that we talked about before already. Admiral Horatio Nelson was in charge of it. Nobody beats Britain in the water, right? Their naval fleet would also be able to protect these trade company vessels, make it so people could not raid them, take those items, or actually move off of them, right? And so as goods are beginning to be produced during the Industrial Revolution, that means that those trade companies are going to be able to safely take them from one location to another, making Britain an expansive amount of money, right? So like now, going on to it as well, Britain also just had access to tons of raw materials coming from their colonies through these trade companies, right? Raw cotton was coming in from India by this point, right? Cotton also was beginning to be bought and sold from the Americas by this point. You also have the growth of different items like, indigo coming from different like areas like throughout the Caribbean, sugarcane coming in from the Caribbean as well. So you had access to a lot of these different items. Another big raw material as well was lumber, huge amounts of timber coming in from Canada and other areas like that are going to give them the ability to build these machines and use what they need to use, right? The other big thing about it though that Britain has is huge deposits of iron and coal, okay? Like now, this is really important for their growth because as these products begin to be increased, they need to lay rails to move them from one location to another. The rails are made out of iron, right? So, and they have tons of iron in Britain, and it's also close to the surface, right? Some people actually always ask, like history professors, they're like, okay, but we understand that China also has really large deposits of iron and coal. Why didn't they use them? Why didn't the Industrial Revolution happen there first? They've always been like hundreds of years more advanced in scientific study than many of the European countries. Well, the biggest reason behind it is that that the iron and coal deposits are close to the surface in Great Britain, so the mines didn't have to be dug very deeply. Whereas in China, they're actually much deeper. All right, so like now, coal is also going to be used in the production of iron, and it's also going to be used in the production of many other items using the smelting process, right? Then also the other big thing about it is that Britain's also just separate from the continent, right? It's separate from the continent. So when the French Revolution breaks out, they're not touched by it. When Napoleon is taking over all of Europe, Britain's like, whatever, bro, we're just going to keep trading. Even when Napoleon tries to set up the continental system to prevent these cheap goods coming from Britain, they're like, whatever, Portugal and Russia will trade with us, and also we'll just trade with all of our colonies. We don't really care, right? So the thing about it that you need to understand is that's going to really help the growth of their revolution, right? But the thing you also need to understand more than anything else that we'll talk about like real quick in the next like 30 seconds is that changes in farming are going to be the biggest reason why the Industrial Revolution can happen, okay? Because as you know, for the longest time during the Industrial Revolution, most people were, before the Industrial Revolution, most people were farmers. It was a very agrarian style setup. To live, you had to farm, and you had to farm in ways that were very unproductive and took your entire day, right? Well, in the 1600s, an agricultural revolution will actually change the old way of farming, making a new, more efficient system, providing workers for the factories as the factories rise up. So go ahead and jot this down, but we're going to begin our next lesson talking about that old way of farming and how an agricultural revolution will increase the productivity of the Industrial Revolution. We'll talk about that soon. Y'all have a good one. Can't wait. See y'all soon.